Tonight, Rabbi Berezin was also going to join us, but she's a little bit under the weather. So we turn it over to the capable hands of Hazzan Michael Krausman, and I'll let him go ahead and introduce the topic and take it from there.
Thank you very much, Mark. It is, first of all, I want to say that I was really looking forward to the honor and the privilege of teaching with Rabbi Berezin. And so I'd like to start by wishing her a refuah shlema, a full and complete recovery. And she definitely owes me one. But anyway, so today's topic is, as you can see on my cheat notes there, Peru or Vu, which is the biblical commandment to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and master it, as you can see from Genesis. And the topic is Peru or Vu, but what happens if you can't? And so that's the topic. And this is, again, one of those topics where you could answer it in one sentence and then send everybody home. But I bet you guys would be mad at me if I did that, although maybe I don't want to take a poll on that. So I'm going to just say that that's probably the case. And so we're going to take a look at some of the issues surrounding this question. I should say off the bat, and this is, probably, the way our Beit Midrash is structured, that I am giving you what is mostly the United Synagogue, the conservative movement perspective on the issue. And so sometimes it'll refer to some Orthodox response on the issue. And most likely when things are quoted from classic rabbinic sources, the Talmud is the Talmud. Doesn't matter whether you're Reform, Orthodox, Conservative Reform, Agnostic, Par, whatever you ascribe to, the Talmud is the Talmud, the Torah is the Torah. It's how you understand them that makes a difference between the movements. And so we might see a little bit of that in the course of what we're talking about. So what I did in order to put this together is I looked at some responsa, mostly from the law committee of the conservative United Synagogue of the Rabbinical Assembly. So just a quick note just to elaborate on what that is. So if you don't know, the United Synagogue is, when it comes to Jewish law, the law is decided by the Rabbinical Assembly. The Rabbinical Assembly is a body that is a professional organization for conservative rabbis, and the Rabbinical Assembly has a law committee. And the law committee meets several times during the year, and they consider questions. So the way the conservative approach to halakha, to Jewish law, is that if you have a question about Jewish law, can I drive to shul on Shabbat? That's a good question. And your local rabbi might say, I know a lot about Shabbat. I know a lot about driving, but I can't find a real good answer to this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send this in as a question to the law committee. And the law committee is made up of a number of rabbis from various sides of the movement. And they meet and they issue a responsa. And a responsa is an answer to a Jewish question based on sources and precedents from Jewish law. And what happens is that there are a number of people on the committee, I think about 20, 25, and they vote. If everybody on the committee votes that in one way, then that becomes a unanimous decision. But often there are majority and minority opinions on each question. And it's up to the local rabbi, once again, that we refer to as the Mar D'Atra, or the master or the chief rabbi of the area, to decide which answer makes the best for them. So for example, the driving to shul on question, which was posed many, many years ago, there was a minority opinion which permitted driving to shul on Shabbat if you don't pass anything, and if you only drive to shul, you go home, because the opinion felt it's more important to be together with the community than apart. But that's that. So, but that's not really part of our topic, but just to tell you where the information that I'm referring to came from. So I'm going to take a look at this, and I'm going to look at it and to try to chop it up into little pieces, other than giving you the quick answer, which is, well, you're supposed to be fruitful and multiply. If you can't, you should do your best. Thank you very much. Everybody have a great evening. Go home and eat latkes. But I'm not going to do that. So instead, we'll look at some different sides of the issue and topics that I looked to the law committee for. And one topic that I got an answer that's based on the law committee's response, but from a noted conservative scholar. So kind of broke it up into two questions, which is, question number one is, what if you don't want to be fruitful or multiply? I mean, it says you're supposed to, but what if you don't want to, for whatever reason? And then the second question, which is the one we're really going to look at, is, what if you do want to be fruitful and multiply, but need help? So to me, those are the two parts of the question. We're going to spend more time on the second part of the question than we are on the first, because that's really what the topic is. And I know Jenny packs a heck of a right book, so I don't want to make her mad. So perhaps we'll leave the other parts of the question for another time. But in terms of what if you don't want to be fruitful and multiply, I looked at two different questions, which is contraception, right? Is it okay to use contraception according to Jewish law? Because if you don't want to be fruitful and multiply, that's one way to approach to that. And the other approach is what they refer to as reproductive freedom, which is a nice way of saying abortion. And we'll look at those if we have time. And if we don't have time, I'll give you the bottom line of those. But I really wanted to spend most of my time, and I still have lots of time, so talking about the actual topic at hand. And so that's what we're going to do. All right, so in terms of what are you supposed to do if you want to be fulfilling the mitzvah of Peru, you want to be fruitful and multiply, but you can't. And so I guess the first option is adoption. And so we'll take a look. Yay, adoption. All right, so on your screen, you can see a copy of the tshuva. Tshuva means answer, right? You have a she'ela, a question, and a teshuvah, an answer, right? Of course, being a Jewish response, the question is one sentence long and the answer is 12 pages. But we won't read all 12 pages, but we'll kind of break it up. But you can see if you look at the very top, you can see how this works. So the committee voted with a vote of 21 in favor and none in abstention and none abstained. So this was a unanimous decision of the law committee of the Rabbinical Assembly, okay? And the question is, can a statutorily adopted child be considered equal in familiar obligations and halachic status to that of a biological child, right? So if you adopt a child, according to Jewish law, is that child the same as if you had given birth to that child? And then through what mechanism can parents who statutorily adopt a child record and affirm their halachic parent-child relationship? So the other part of this, is when you adopt a child, you go to a lawyer or an agency and you fill out all kinds of paperwork and you pay all kinds of fees and you go through this whole process before you can actually come home with a child. So is there some kind of ceremony or some kind of document from a Jewish point of view that recognizes that new relationship between the child and the parent? So those are the questions that they answer. So we're going to take a look at some aspects of this. And the first thing we're going to do is they go into a little bit of a historical perspective, and they're going to take a look at kind of the history of adoption in rabbinic and biblical times. So we're going to skip to page 4 here. Okay, see, this is kind of like having a good service. It only counts if you get to skip some pages. So we're going to skip some pages. Here we go. So the beginning of the tshuva says, given the importance that the Bible placed on caring for the orphan, the rabbis of the Talmud decided to formalize and encourage guardians to provide a home for those most in need. In other words, the rabbis of the Talmud sought to evolve and qualify the non-biological form of familiar growth that we call adoption. Despite the equivocal evidence of biblical abortion, there is significant evidence that the rabbinic sources held the institution of adoption in high regard. So the first thing they're going to talk about is apotropos, which sounds like a Greek word, and it is, but it is a technical term that we find in rabbinic law for guardianship. And you can see that Jewish law does provide for consequences essentially similar to those caused by adoption to be created by legal means. So that means that the adopters, people who are guardians that are trusted with authority to care for the child's personal welfare and taking care of the child's property, which in rabbinic times that was super huge, and thereby assuming all financial and parental obligations as halacha imposes on parents, right? So Jewish law imposes certain obligations that on parents, and according to this, a guardian would have been appointed by the rabbinic court, and once that person is appointed, they are halachically obligated by Jewish law to take care of the kid in every way. Okay, and then here he's kind of giving a hint to the fact that the rabbinic court had a teudat minui, which means a document of appointment. So he's setting the groundwork for coming up with a document that we can use to kind of sanctify an act of adoption. So of course, we're talking about Peru or Vu. So the next question that we're going to talk about is adoption as fulfillment of this mitzvah of Peru or Vu. So we're going to skip to page 7. Look at all the neat things we're skipping. But I just want to point out some of the sources as we're scrolling through here, some of the sources in rabbinic literature for adoption. Whoever brings an orphan in his house, Scripture ascribes it to him as though he had begotten him. So according to Jewish law, the Talmud regards an adopted child the same as a child that is born to the mother, to the family in a natural way. And also, the rabbinic law elevated the practice of adoption, which meant, and they also said that not only they fulfilling the mitzvah of caring for an orphan, but they are also fulfilling the mitzvah of tzedakah, right? And here's a beautiful quote from Rabbi Shmuel ben Nachami. This is referring to one who raises an orphan boy or an orphan girl in his house and takes care of them through to his or her marriage. So we can see that the rabbis of the Talmud were very, very much in favor of adoption and gave high praise and a very important status to those who chose or were able to perform that great mitzvah of taking a child into their home. And then here is the question that we want to talk about. And they cite a question that was first posed by Rabbi Shlomo Kluger. You can see his dates, 1785 to 1869. So this is not a brand new question, is whether one who raises a non-biological child fulfills his or her obligation to be fruitful and multiply. So do you fulfill your obligation to procreate by adopting a child? And then he goes to answers, well, it said before, whosoever raises a child is considered as if that child is their child. And therefore you would have to say that you could argue that he did in fact fulfill that mitzvah. And so that's an important note, even in rabbinic times, that this is, Peru is the very first commandment in the entire Bible. So, to fulfill the first commandment is very huge. And here the rabbis outline what are the obligations of a parent to a child. So first of all, if it's a male child, you're supposed to circumcise them, right? We know that was commanded in the book of Genesis, right? You're supposed to circumcise him, and then you're supposed to redeem him. So according to Jewish law, the firstborn male child belongs to the temple. He is obligated to serve in the Beit Midrash, the temple in Jerusalem, not Temple Israel. Though if they want to serve there, that's a beautiful idea, but they're talking about the ancient temple in Jerusalem. And so in order to avoid that, you have to redeem them. And we have this wonderful ceremony called Pidyon Haben, where you find a Kohen and you literally buy back your kid from that Kohen. Is the Kohen is a descendant of the priestly caste that ran the temple. And it's something you do when the kid's a baby, because if you waited until the kid was in college, you may not be willing to do that. So very wise, especially if they're a teenager. Many of us have wanted to see if we could get our money back, but not my kids, of course, but other kids, I'm sure. You're supposed to teach your child Torah, as is commanded in the book of Deuteronomy, and teach them to your children. Okay, this is part of the Shema, right, that we say. You're supposed to find a wife for him, as is commanded in the book of Jeremiah. And you're supposed to teach them a trade, as commanded in the book of Ecclesiastes. Enjoy happiness with the woman you love, all the fleeting days of life that have been granted to you under the sun, all your fleeting days. So from this, they understood that they meant that just as a father is bound to take a wife for him, so he's bound to teach him a craft for his livelihood. And also, you're supposed to teach your kid how to swim. That is also a rabbinic dictum, because the child's life may depend on it. So obviously, this is why they created JCC, so that you can fulfill that mitzvah of teaching your kid how to swim, especially if you yourself don't know how to swim. So obviously, a lot of these things have to be kind of understood in a more modern concept. So, teaching them trade, obviously provide the kid an education, teach them Torah. Again, you want them to have a Jewish education. And then he says, in terms of marrying them off, you're supposed to kind of, there are several approaches for parents in a kind of modern interpolation of the Talmudic to marry off their children, which bear deep personal significance for couples, for their parents, and for the Jewish people as a whole. So, you want to hope that your children find a relationship in which they can bear children or raise children, so that we can continue the Jewish people. So whether that means marrying them off in a conventional sense or whatever it means, but that we hope our kids find a relationship in which they feel comfortable bringing up a child. So that's what they mean. That's how we understand that in modern days. So another thing I'm going to look at, which is the question of mourning. If you adopt a child, what is their relationship and what are their obligations in terms of mourning? So we're going to skip some more. This is so much fun. All right. So mourning adoptive parents, an interesting topic that kind of goes in the whole, I might have to move a little bit quicker. But so basically, the adopted child should observe the prescribed mourning observances towards his adoptive parents just as a natural child should mourn his or her natural parents. So, and secondly, if the child is adopted into a family with siblings who are the biological children of the adoptive parents, all children should equally observe traditional Jewish bereavement practices, namely Shiva and Shloshim. So the bottom line is that it is a fulfillment of the mitzvah of Peru or Vu, of being fruitful and multiply, to adopt a child. It is a very highly lauded and a beautiful thing to do. And that once a child is adopted, in every sense of the word, there is no difference between a child that is adopted and a child that was born in a natural manner in terms of Jewish law. And in terms of Jewish practice, it is nice that they're putting together kind of a formal ceremony, similar to what you'd find at a baby naming or a bris, to kind of formalize an adoption. And that's definitely a beautiful idea. So the next topic that we're going to look at is in vitro fertilization. And that's an interesting, kind of a more modern topic, because obviously the rabbis of the Talmud, excuse me, did not consider this as an issue. It wasn't something that they had back there. So how did the rabbis find rabbinic precedent in order to answer this question, right? So the question is, may an infertile couple utilize IVF, in vitro fertilization, using the husband's sperm and wife's egg to have a child? What is the status of the offspring? 2, does halacha provide any guidance regarding the transfer of embryos to the woman's uterus for gestation? And 3, may more embryos be created by IVF than are needed for immediate use? And 4, is IVF using donated sperm and or ova permitted? What is the status of the offspring? So those are the essential questions that the Rabbinical Assembly Law Committee looked at in considering this matter. So let's take a look at the tshuva. The answer to this, not that one. Ooh, okay. Oh, we did that. Interesting. All right, my screen is being hidden by my Zoom. I wonder what happened. I think I got it. Let's see. I think we have it. Let's see. There we go. Thank you very much. Everything about Zoom, you learn every time you do Zoom, you find out something new that becomes, you have to figure out how to work around. So, we've been using Zoom for, I don't know, a couple of years. We're still every time like, oh, how do you do that? All right. So this is a paper that was authored by Rabbi Aaron Mackler. It was approved by the Committee of Law and Jewish Law and Standards on December 13th, 1995, by a vote of 24 in favor and 1 abstention. Okay, so again, here we had the questions, the she'elah is the question, the teshuvah is the answer. Okay, so he begins by saying that Judaism values children as a blessing for their parents and for the broader community. For those able to do so, having children represents the fulfillment of a mitzvah, one that can be traced back to God's charge to be fruitful and multiply. Again, so that's kind of our topic. So we're going to see that a lot. And this is part of the biblical account of creation. In vitro fertilization, like other reproductive technologies, offers the potential to bring a new child into the world. Okay, and in appropriate cases, this can provide life to a child who otherwise would not have been born, add joy and harmony to the family, and contribute to the strengthening of the Jewish community. Okay, so he is starting right off the bat by saying that IVF, in vitro fertilization, is a good thing. So just in case we're not familiar with the process, you'll find that in these rabbinic teshuvahs, rabbinic responsa, that a lot of work is put into any science that is behind the answer. So if there is science that needs to be learned, then rabbis will consult either a scientist that is conversant with Jewish law or a rabbi that's conversant with that particular branch of science. And there are rabbis that specialize in different branches of science, and reproductive issues is one of those that there are several rabbis which have great expertise. So just to give you, you probably know this, but in vitro fertilization involves the fertilization of an ovum outside the body. In vitro, which literally means in glass, refers to the petri dish in which the sperm and ova are combined. Okay? And it's saying that this was first done in July 1978. So as practiced today, a woman preparing for IVF receives hormones to stimulate development of several ova. Shortly before ovulation, which would occur, a physician uses ultrasound to guide a needle through the cervix to the ovaries to gather or receive the developed ova. After inspection and appropriate preparation, the ova are combined with prepared sperm. Resulting embryo is allowed to develop for a period of up to a few days. Now you'll notice in the bottom are all kinds of precedents for these, just give you all kinds of footnotes which have precedents and other sources. It takes a long time to put together one of these tshuvas, one of these responsa, and to have it read by the committee many times and then finally voted on. Okay, once it reaches the stage of 2 to 8 cells, it is then transferred to a woman's uterus using a catheter inserted through the cervix. When the procedure is successful, the embryo continues to develop and implants in the uterus, leading to pregnancy and the birth of a child. At the 2 to 8 cell stage, the embryo could be cryopreserved, which is another name for frozen, for transfer at a later time, right? So I guess you can do that with leftover chicken soup too. You can cryopreserve it for next Shabbos. Okay, so the first issue is in vitro fertilization using a couple's own ova and sperm. So we're going to take a look at that. There it is. Okay. Once again, it would take, if we wanted to, we could spend several hours on each one of these responsa and analyze them and look at all the precedents. It's a very fascinating process. So most halakhic authorities have addressed the issue of in vitro fertilization and have treated the issue similar to artificial insemination. Many permit in vitro fertilization using a wife's egg and a husband's sperm. Central issues typically include whether the husband violates the prohibition against wasteful emission of seeds. So we're going to take a look at some of the halachic issues that they have to tackle in order to make this permissible. And one of it is that prohibition against wasteful emission of seed. It's a major problem in Jewish law. Producing sperm in order to fertilize an egg would not represent emission of seed in vain, but the husband's intention is procreative. While IVF raises some legitimate concerns, those must be weighed against the happiness of the couple among the people of Israel. So that's kind of they kind of take that argument off the table right away. That this certainly is not a inappropriate use of seed. The Bible has this image of, we just read it in last week's Torah portion of Onan, one of the characters in the story who didn't want to participate in a levirate marriage. That's another whole problem. He didn't want to have to become the father of a child to his widowed, to the wife, the widow of his brother, because that would mess up his whole inheritance. It's a whole long misa, and if you want to know more about that, consult a rabbi. But anyway, that's the neat thing about being a cantor. You can always say, go ask the rabbi. So, but this is certainly not that. This is certainly not someone who spills their seed in order to avoid an obligation. This is someone who is producing sperm in order to fulfill an obligation. So that's right off the table, right away. And then The next thing they talk about is pre-implantation genetic testing. So let's take a look and see what they mean by that. Okay, where are we? So looking at some of the issue. We're looking at some of the other risks that could be involved. Some of that the Jewish ideal, what is possible, is for children to be conceived through marital intercourse. But of course, if that's not possible, then IVF again should be considered okay by Jewish law. So just some other possible, that's kind of the way we work, right? As Jews, we kind of find like the worst case scenario, and we try to work around it. Oh, you do this, somebody could get hurt, so then maybe you shouldn't do it. No, well, you know what? It's more important to do it than run the risk that someone should get hurt. And so that's basically what they're saying here, that any medical procedure could come with risks, but on the other hand, it's more important to do that. All right. So let's see if we can find page 7. I think I can do that. All right, so here we're going to go through some of the procedural elements of the in vitro fertilization and some of the different components that go with it, and see what halachic pitfalls may come up according to the law committee and how they can be tackled if at all. So one of the issues is pre-implantation genetic testing. And so basically genetic diagnosis and selected transfer of embryos is what they're talking about. So before an embryo is implanted, it's possible to withdraw a little bit of genetic material, a little bit of DNA, and test to see if, God forbid, there is some genetic issue. They use in the example they talked about, things like Tay-Sachs or things like that could develop. And so is it okay to test the embryo before it's implanted to make sure that you're not going to be implanting an embryo with one of these afflictions? And so he says that genetic diagnosis and selective transfer of embryos is clearly no more problematic than prenatal diagnosis and abortion of fetuses affected with severe genetic disease, which has been accepted in the conservative movement and by some orthodoxy. If anything, selective non-transfer of an early in vitro embryo would be preferable to abortion of a more fully developed fetus in utero. So the use of IVF for genetic testing faces great practical obstacles. The risks and uncertainties of IVF would preclude requiring such use for the foreseeable future. So he's saying you can't use it. You can't say, well, I'm not sure if my baby is going to be okay or not. I'm going to go through in vitro fertilization and then test the embryo. And then if it's okay, then have it implanted. You have to decide first that your best option is IVF, and then if they happen to do some genetic testing, that's okay. The second issue, which is kind of interesting, is the issue of gender selection. And is that okay? Can you use because if you can test for these genetic problems, these genetic diseases, disorders, whatever the correct term is, can you say, I want to make sure I have a boy, or I want to make sure I have a girl, and then have the embryos tested for gender to make sure you get the flavor of kid that you want. And so in some cases, a severe genetic disease may be linked to a sex chromosome. And so primarily children of only one gender, generally males, for example. If a woman is a carrier for Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, half of her sons, but none of her daughters would likely be affected by the disease. So if there's a strong possibility that a genetic disease that is carried on the sex determining chromosome is present, then it may be okay to do genetic testing to find out the gender, because in that particular case, the woman had a very strong possibility of producing an offspring with this terrible disease. And why not avoid bringing such a child who would face all kinds of terrible suffering potentially? Or why not avoid having to have an abortion or some other bad solution to the pregnancy if you can take care of it before there even is a pregnancy? And that's kind of their standpoint on that. Another issue that comes with this is the number of embryos transferred. So if a woman is pregnant with 2 fetuses, multifetal pregnancy, a reduction would be halakhically acceptable in appropriate cases, certainly in order to protect the woman from a serious threat to her health, and arguably with the independent justification of protecting the remaining fetuses. So, a lot of times with in vitro fertilization, the process involves implanting a number of embryos, hoping that at least one will be viable. And if you have more than a couple, is it okay? And to say, well, this woman, does not want to have, 6 babies all at one time. God forbid. That's just, it's a very dangerous situation. How can it's very hard for a family to support that. It could be very dangerous for both the mother and for the baby. So is it okay to remove some of the embryos under those circumstances? And so they're saying that it is, but they're saying that the specific concern of Jewish law and ethics to minimize risks to the women and fetuses provides additional support for this limit. So what they're saying is there is a movement among certain medical societies to limit the number of embryos that can be implanted in the first place. And that way you don't have to worry about removing ones that may not be viable, or selecting which ones you're going to keep or not keep. So that may be a good solution, and certainly a better solution in terms of Jewish law, because the number one concern in anything concerning Jewish law is, preserving people's health and well-being. And so that is another solution. Another issue, and one more issue, is embryos that are not transferred for gestation. So it's possible that, in the process of in vitro fertilization, they collect a number of embryos, and the process is to fertilize as many embryos as possible, hoping that they would select the most viable to implant, and that those to be introduced into the woman's uterus, and that they would become implanted and result in healthy babies. But sometimes they have a number of embryos. They have extra ones, and so what do we do for that? And so again, we go back to the issue of cryopreservation or freezing. So what is usually done is these extra embryos are frozen for later use. And we're talking about something that is just a handful of cells big. We're not talking about anything that's recognizable as a baby. 2 to 8 cells, maybe a few more cells, according to my understanding. And if there's a doctor out there, I'm sorry. I'm not really a doctor, I just play one on TV, right? And so it would be halakhically acceptable. Obviously, you have to create more, that's the process. And it would be permitted to freeze the extra embryos, because they will enhance the likelihood of success by making more than just a couple, and minimize the risks and burdens faced by the woman. Excuse me. So, however, freezing embryos with the possibility of future transfer and maintaining them in a frozen state also appear to be consistent with any obligations concerning appropriate treatment of the embryos. So other options are a little problematic, although not necessarily prohibited. So one is thawing a frozen embryo without transferring it, so that the embryo dies, which is probably the most problematic approach. Or two, using the embryo for scientific research. Or three, donating the embryo for use by another. So those are the three possibilities they can do. They can apply with the extra embryos that are created. And according to Jewish law, obviously you're, and here he says it, the early embryo should be accorded a significant degree of respect and sanctity as a wondrous divine creation and potential human life. However, they're not saying that these embryos are human lives, right? According to Jewish law, an embryo is not even considered a potential person unless they are implanted in the uterus. Once the embryo becomes implanted in the uterus, then destroying that embryo comes under the realm of abortion. And that's another topic that we kind of hinted at and perhaps we'll get to, but certainly at this stage, it's a potential human life, but it's not considered a human life. So there are no issues in terms of that, but it is still something that is accorded a significant degree of respect and sanctity, which is a good way to put it. Moreover, embryos at the early stage in which freezing occurs are still a mass of undifferentiated cells, which can give rise to two or more embryos. So again, that's the whole point. We're not dealing with something that's a baby or anything like that. It's just a handful of cells that have the potential to turn into a potential human life. But he also says that the use of embryos for non-therapeutic research in order to gain scientific knowledge, but without the expectation that the embryo would be transferred for gestation, is a topic of current controversy in the United States and other countries, right? So, all this stuff about stem cells and all those things are topics that are not only topics for halacha, for Jewish law, but topics that are being debated in our secular law as well. And then the next thing he tackles is donor sperm, eggs, and embryos. And that's gonna lead us into our next overall issue in a little bit. So some couples aren't able to have children using their own sperm and eggs, even with the assistance of procedures such as IVF, right? So sometimes either the one member of the couple, for whatever reason, cannot produce the element that they need to produce in order to, whether it's a man not being able to produce sperm or women not be able to produce viable eggs, whatever it is, it's not, in vitro fertilization which usually involves the two parents combining their genetic material in a test tube or in a petri dish, that won't work. And so they say that the cases raise a difficult question of whether sperm, eggs, or embryos donated by another person may be used by a couple to have a child. So his answer, and he agrees with Rabbi Elliot Dorff, who was a major Jewish thinker and a great rabbi. So he concurs, and he says that I concur with Rabbi Dorff's position with regard to use of sperm in IVF, including the guidelines and restrictions that accompany permission for the use of donor gametes, right? So gametes mean the male and female elements that we put together to facilitate reproduction. And extends the use of donated eggs and embryos, right? So again, there's a whole question about, these are holy things and are not to be misused, but on the other hand, it is something which can be done under Jewish law. And he said the decision by either member of the couple not to make use of the procedures must be fully respected. So the couple can decide that they would like to use either a donor sperm or a donor egg as they feel works for them. And you can't really say that they are passing up the possibility for procreation if they feel as though this is going to cause them some moral dilemma. Now, another issue is the issue of maternal identity, and that's going to pop up in other considerations as well. Because if a woman gives an egg to another woman to use as IVF in vitro fertilization, who's the mother of the kid? And if, according to Jewish law, if the donor egg comes from a woman that's not Jewish, is the baby that's born Jewish, or do they need to go to the mikveh? And so to answer that question, rabbinic sources suggest that maternal identity is to be determined primarily by gestation and birth, right? So according to Jewish law, your mother is the person that gave birth to you, unless you're adopted according to a legal adoption process, right? And he uses the example of a woman converts while pregnant. The child does not require conversion, even if it was conceived before conversion, because at the time of the birth, his mother was already Jewish, right? So by this, we learn that the mother is Jewish, and so it doesn't matter what about the donor is, it doesn't matter. You can decide whether the donor has status or not. They also talk about whether it's okay to donate sperm or eggs. And of course, it's certainly the only thing that you have to worry about is you have to make sure that the donor of the sperm or the egg, that you kind of have to make sure that the resulting offspring of that union does not come into a point where they will have relationships with another result of the combination of that sperm and that egg, or any combination thereof. So in other words, a person may not, who was conceived by IVF, may not realize, but they're actually involved in a relationship with someone who is actually their sibling. Not even knowing that, but it doesn't matter that much halachically by Jewish law, but it sure does matter genetically, because it's, as we know, it's really a bad situation to have people who are genetically that close related for them to produce offspring. There's all kinds of protocols. And the last thing that we're going to look at here, and then if there's time, maybe we'll allow for questions. Not that I have any answers, but we'll allow, and that is the issue of surrogate parenting. And the question is, what does Jewish law have to say about conceiving children through surrogacy? And so the answer is, from the point of view of halacha, the main questions are, is this permissible before the fact? And after the fact, who is the mother? The woman who donates the ovum, or the woman who gives birth to the baby, or both? All right, so some conservative rabbis are okay with this, and some are not. So let's take a look at the issue. And here we're going to take a look at an article by Rabbi David Golinkin, who is a foremost rabbi and philosopher and thinker in the conservative Jewish world. And he wrote this responsa in a publication called Responsa in a Moment. And it was published in December 2012. All right, so the article, he quotes Rabbi Eli Spitz, who says there's two kinds of surrogate mother. There's an ovum surrogate, which is the most common. Both her ovum and her womb are used. This is because the intended mother lacks healthy ovaries or the ability to carry a baby to term, right? So in other words, you find another woman, you use the sperm from the father, and you use both the womb and the ovum of the surrogate to produce a baby. The other option is a gestational surrogate, which they also call a tummy mummy, in which the mother and father produce a fetus through IVF, and then this fertilized egg, this embryo, sorry, I'm using the wrong term, this embryo is then implanted into the ovary of the surrogate, right? So two possible ways to do this, right? One where you're just using the father's sperm into the donor, and one where you're using both the father's sperm and the mother's egg, and that's implanted in the donor. Okay, you see here that it's not a cheap deal. Surrogacy costs between $22,000 and $42,000. A lot of times it ends up with lawsuits, and sometimes it can get into a mess. Just interestingly enough, in Israel, only gestational surrogacy is allowed, right? So the only surrogacy that they will use is the kind where the woman is impregnated with the ovum of the intended parents, right? So both the egg and the sperm belong to the intended parents. That's the only way that's permissible in Jewish law. And so there's two ways to look on this. Either it's okay or it's not, right? There's no there's no middle ground in this particular issue, right? Either you can do it or you can't. And so oh, okay, that's interesting. So we had a person came up in the chat who talked about the rules in Nebraska. Apparently that is not something that is cool in Nebraska, so shockingly. All right, and so the Rabbi Spitz is going to give reasons why this might be okay. And he starts off with a biblical precedent, which is the story of a shikha, or a handmaid, that is given to over to the husband when the wife is unable to have children. Of course, the classic example is Abraham and Sarah, where she asked Hagar to be her surrogate. And then, of course, we also have other examples of Rachel asking Bilhah, her servant, to consort with her husband so that she may bear on her needs, so that she gave her handmaid Bilhah as a concubine, and Jacob cohabited with her, and the same story with Leah as well. However, despite the difference between biblical handmaid and the modern surrogate, there are three shared values. The use of a third party is permitted as a last resort. Although the children born to the handmaid, the Torah recognized the maternal role of the intended mother. And although the handmaid was not recognized as a wife, her children were treated as descendants of the patriarch with full inheritance rights. All right. And then he goes through some of the other objections that you might have and kind of disputes them. But one thing he says, maternal identity is determined by gestation and birth. So the gestational surrogate mother is not just an incubator or a tummy mummy, she is the mother of the child. Okay, so these are examples of why it would not be okay, by the way. So that's one reason why. Two, there's a danger of treating children as commodities. In some cases, the intended parents sought to refuse custody. And three, the typical surrogate is married, has two other children, and there's a psychological harm to children who see their mother go through pregnancy, give birth, and then give the child away. Okay, and then of course there are other things that he has problems with. And he says that either member of the couple would be justified in the decision not to proceed with surrogacy. The surrogate mother is the halachic mother of the child. We talked about before that no matter what, whoever gives birth to the kid, that that person is their mother. And second of all, the surrogate mother can be reimbursed for expenses, but you can't pay her to give up her baby because that is purchasing a baby or selling a baby, which is absolutely forbidden according to Jewish law. And I would suspect in civil law as well, right? And then there's a question of who is the mother, because as we said, we know that the surrogate mother is the mother according to Jewish law because she's the one who gave birth to the baby. So Rabbi Golinkin is really not in favor of surrogacy. He's saying that the precedent of the concubines is not the same thing because they kind of were treated as a wife, whereas a surrogate is just kind of a person that is contracted for this particular job. He didn't like the idea of children being created as a commodity. And he says there are three partners according to Jewish law in a person: the Holy One, blessed be he, and his father and his mother. So he's basically, his bottom line is, if a couple cannot conceive, it would be much better for them to adopt a child, rather than create a whole host of ethical dilemmas. Adopting a child is a great mitzvah. It provides a loving home for thousands of unwanted children. So again, he goes back to saying that surrogacy is not a good choice, that adoption or IVF are both better options. So that's what conservative Jewish law says on the topic. Just in terms of abortion, just so that we are clear, Jewish law absolutely does permit abortion, not just at will, that there has to be some demonstrable reason to assume that the pregnancy would cause harm to the mother, either for sure physically and even emotionally. And in terms of birth control, that's also something that is permissible under certain conditions, and different forms of birth control may be more problematic than others. So if we ever get into that, we'll talk about that. I think we have a few minutes for questions. If anybody has any questions, it's a lot of information. You should have just got my first answer, which is do it the best you can.
Do you have an idea of how much more liberal the conservative view would be than the Orthodox?
So I think in some cases, a little bit more liberal,
Just a little.
and in some cases, a lot more. The nice thing about conservative law is that it allows for a wide spectrum of interpretation. But as you saw, as we went through all these exhaustive teshuvot, these responsum, some people say, they're conservatives and do whatever the heck they want. But it is a very careful reading of rabbinic law and precedents. But it works just like two rabbis can consult the same precedents and come up with learn something different from it. Just like you can have two lawyers look at the same case law and come up with each use the same case as an argument for the same case as an argument for either side of the issue. So in generally conservative law may be a little bit more liberal on this, but not so far afield from what, if something says it's, you can't do it. If it says so straight up in the Torah or in Jewish law, the rabbis have a tough time. Conservative rabbis have a much harder time finding a way to make it possible.
Thank you.
If you have questions, just jump in there unless you get unruly and we'll have you raise your hand.
The nice thing is, I think we'll have an Orthodox rabbi that'll also talk about this in a future session.
I think that's right.
So they'll be much better at answering that question than I will. Yes, any other questions?
I do have one.
Oh, okay, good.
There was one section where you're talking about the number of embryos that were being implanted, and it seemed like the answer, the most preferred answer was, well, don't put so many in there. But that kind of begs the question: is there an explanation that goes much beyond that?
From the Reformed Rabbi Mark Gelman, plus another moral concern. Oh, well, I didn't see all that whole thing. maybe we can bring that back up again. Oh, okay, that's interesting. Thank you. All right, so she's saying that it is, you're introducing a third party, potentially, if the surrogate is married, then you're kind of introducing a third party into their marriage, which is kind of like adultery. So that's very interesting as well. Right, the sanctity of family. That's a very important concept. And one of the reasons that some of the conservative rabbis as well were not crazy about that. So the question of how many embryos are implanted. So I can only tell you that my expertise is exactly what I've told you. I'm neither a doctor, nor I can even say that I pretend or play a doctor on TV. I'm a Hazzan, so that would be a question for a person who's qualified to answer that. The article that the Tshuva did cite the results of a Canadian study that was done by, I would assume, an important medical institution, which said that 3 may be enough, and that too many may cause problems that, that may override the benefits of having more than 3 implanted. So he did cite that study, but I don't have any, I'm reading what I see on the paper.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking that the likelihood that there's gonna be more than one is probably 100%. And then at what point do you say, okay?
Right. And that, so that introduces another, a level of, moral and ethical issues. But in terms of in vitro fertilization, our rabbis feel as though that is something that's worth tackling, those issues, because in the end, it's going to result in the fulfillment of the obligation to be fruitful and multiply. And so it should be a good thing for the family, where, and you're still getting your own genetic material in a way. So, it becomes more of a question, I guess, if neither the sperm nor the egg is genetically related to the parents, but yet they still have the ability for the woman to bear a child.
Yeah.
So that's an important thing for a family.
Any other questions? Thank you for attending. We will have a session next week as well, so
Okay.
come back again.
Okay, thank you very much. It's been really nice to be with you all this evening, and have a great evening and a happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah. Hag Sameach.
Thank you, Hazzan. Thank you, everyone.
Good job, Kara.
Thank you, Michael, very much.
Okay, my pleasure.